and welcome to this quick tool review. This time around we'll be reviewing a tool that is common to pretty much everyone's shop. Even if you don't do metalworking, you probably have one of these lying around. And we're talking about the bench vise. I had a different one, which you've seen in other videos, but the damn thing would never lock, no matter how tight you made it. And it was a made in China vise that cost originally around 40 bucks 25 years ago. It was decent enough. The front jaw and inside column was fully cast, as well as the outer part, and had a very large anvil, a 4x4 anvil with 1/2 inch thick plate that is welded on the top. But the jaws were really sloppy. This one, not so much. And you could not lock the rotating base hardly at all. And they used soft steel for the bars, and by hand I was able to bend the bars trying to tighten enough to make the base not move. So I decided to step up, and I looked all around the market, and there are a bunch of brands like Yost and Palmgren and Wilton, of course. And I settled on Palmgren because I wanted a fairly large jaw set that was removable, and I wanted the price to be somewhat reasonable. Now the list price on this guy is 435 bucks. It is 65,000 PSI ductile iron, so it's pretty high quality ductile iron, not your standard 30,000 or less. So that's a huge plus. My old vise, the bottom jaw was C-shaped and it was open on both sides, so dirt and crap would get inside on the screw. This one is fully enclosed, which is also another nice touch, with an anvil that's not welded on, it's cast in. 6-inch jaws. My last one was 5.5-inch jaws, and like I said, they were removable because that was a requirement I had, because the first thing I do when I get a new vise, or when I have a vise, is I replace the jaws with copper so that I don't mar the things I'm working on. Picked up that tip from Tom Lipton over at Ox Tools. Great idea, very useful. They do have magnetic clip-ons, but if you ever really cinch down on something and the copper is fairly thin, it'll displace and squeeze. And so the thicker copper jaws don't seem to have that problem anywhere near as much. They're still soft and you still can deform them, but not as bad. I did try some of the magnetic ones and I was not particularly happy with them. Things I like about this style vise versus the Wilton bullet vise is that, like my previous vise, this inside base here is square. So when you're setting up a part and you're trying to do two things at once, it has a place for bigger parts to sit, which can be really handy. I've used it more than once. It's not necessarily obvious, but really handy. My previous vise, the screws that held the jaws in place, they must have drilled them by hand with just holding the jaw in place, because all 4 screws were different heights relative to the base. Both screws on the back jaw are the same height from the base, and the spacing is equal on all 4 screws. However, the front jaws are different spacing to the base relative to the back, which I don't know why they did that, but for some unknown reason they chose to. They're off by just a few, like maybe 20, 30 thousandths. I don't know why they decided to do that, but in any case, that wasn't very handy. Maybe it's how this sat in their jig, but they could have easily compensated for that. So no real good excuse. Also, this vise, I've taken the screws out because I'm prepping to replace the jaws on this. The screws on the base side were cross-threaded in, and they were almost impossible to get out. They were really tough, and when I got them out, I had to toss the screws in the trash, and I had to re-tap the back. They're metric threads, 6x1, so probably made in China as well. My previous vise, also mentioning that it was a C and open, also had a ton of slop when it was loose like this. I mean, a ton of slop, like 1/2 inch side to side. This guy is much tighter, and as you bring the jaws together, they meet. My previous jaws, sometimes they'd meet slipped over one side, sometimes on the other side. So there's a lot more attention to detail in that regard. I still think for the price point, $435 list, I got it for $260 something with $70 some shipping, so make it $330 or $340. Not an inexpensive vise by any stretch, but a hell of a lot cheaper than a $1,200 Wilton bullet vise 6-inch, which I would love to have, but simply can't afford. Also, I think one thing, the Wiltons are beautiful, and the fit and finish is great. I've used them before, but the round shaft is not as handy because, again, you can't set a large part on it to set up a complicated setup when you're trying to do something in the vise. So I actually find the square much more useful. Other than that, I think Palmgren could do a lot better. Clearly, they were shooting for a made-in-China part that was an American vise price, not as expensive as a premium American vise, but still, little disappointed. They certainly don't have to cross-thread screws. They could be consistent about the screw height relative to the machined portion here. Let me get the jaws off and show you the beneath the jaws, because I'm going to remove them anyways. Another close-up look at the jaws here. You can see that they had the jaws installed when they painted the body, which is, you know, kind of tacky. And I think they certainly could do better. It doesn't take that much more time. They claim the jaws are hardened. I see that they've been chrome plated, but let's see if they are actually hardened as well. They're hardened a bit. They're not super hard, but they're not as hard as, they're harder than soft steel, like this guy. And actually not a whole lot. This is cold rolled. Actually, that's about the same size dent. So they don't seem to be very hard. They claim they're hardened, but I think they're using the chrome plating to get away with that, or maybe just the front. Let me take a look here. I won't be using the hardened jaws very much. Nah, they're not particularly hard at all. So that's not great. If you look at the machining here, not particularly great either. Again, the screw hole height from here to this cutout to this ledge is different for these two than it is for these two. Don't know why. The way I found those measurements is I found a pin that fit fairly tightly in the threads, and I measured with my calipers, since I'm not going for a hyper accurate measurement, depth to the base here to the ledge. And same for the spacing. I've got two pins that were 1/1000th apart. One would be tight and one would be a little loose, and measured the spacing between them, subtracted basically one diameter, and that gives you the distance between them. Both sides are within 1/1000th of each other, so at least they made some attempt. But again, overall, I'm a little disappointed because a $400 vise, I think they could take a little more care with than this. Also, this square base piece, as I was talking about on my previous vise, was C-shaped in a solid casting that was part of the front movable jaw. On this guy, this is welded rolled tubing, and they just welded in a couple spots here, almost like tack welded it in place. And I think they could do better than that as well. That's kind of a bit embarrassing if you ask me. I think if they had cast this as all one piece, they would have had to machine the four sides to have this kind of accuracy. But I think it would have been worth it, and they would have had a much better product. So shame on them a bit. I may take a look at a Harbor Freight $100 vise and see how that compares to this, because it might actually be comparable. Palmgren may be relying on their good name and just figuring people like me would say, well, it's a Palmgren, so it's a U.S. company and should be higher quality than Harbor Freight. But you know, it might not be a whole lot more. It's not terrible. Oh, also included, which I forgot to mention, are these pipe holding jaws, which are replaceable and supposedly hardened as well. That's a nice touch, and my previous vise did not have that. Another hint and a useful tool is to have access to a piece of CAD software and a printer. And I printed scale mock-ups of the vise jaws I was going to work on, not 3D, just 2D, to make sure the holes lined up, and cut them out and tested them to make sure that I really was lined up the way I thought. It's a really handy technique. I have used it more than once, and the accuracy of modern laser printers is close to, you know, a couple thousandths of an inch or better. So very handy. So here's the vise with the copper jaws. Use some 1/2 inch by 1 inch stock. And they stand a little bit more proud than these guys. These guys are like 100 thousandths shorter, maybe 150. I haven't measured them that closely, but this is a good fit. They work really well, and they don't mar things. You're cramping them. These guys I'll just save, but probably will never use. if anyone needs the measurements, I have the measurements, and maybe I'll post it in the comments below if people want to know if they get the same vise. But I did go to Harbor Freight as well and look at their current $59 6-inch vise, and it is pretty much a clone of the one I got rid of. So it's a C-channel, open end, so the tightening bar is accessible to the to chips and whatnot, which is not a great idea. But solid cast piece between front and shaft, and the anvil had changed a little bit. It was closer to this style anvil. Also, it was only $59, and if you get a 25% off coupon, well, you see where I'm going with that, 40 bucks. So all in all, I sort of give this a thumbs down for the price, a thumbs up for, you know, medium quality, but overall thumbs down for the price. I think it was too expensive for the quality of build. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hope you found it useful, and hope to see you next time.